Christians, you finally got something right. America is like Sodom and Gomorrah, but not because of gay people, pronouns, or a damn Starbucks cup. No, it's because of you. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. Ezekiel 16:49. You see, according to the Bible, the book you claim to follow, Sodom wasn't destroyed for sexual immorality. It was destroyed for being a cruel, greedy, self-righteous society that turned its back on the poor and suffering. Sound familiar? So yes, you're right. America is just like Sodom and Gomorrah. But not because of drag queens or gay marriage. It's because this country has built an empire on greed, cruelty, and stepping on the necks of the poor, all while you cheer it on in Jesus' name. I'm sure he'd love that. Turns out, God wasn't mad about pride parades. He was pissed about a society that hoarded wealth, punished the weak, and turned human suffering into a business model. He wiped out Sodom because it was full of people that looked down on the struggling and said, "Not my problem." And if that sounds familiar, it's because you're living in it. The modern American Sodom isn't drag queens reading books. It's billionaires hoarding wealth while families sleep in cars. It's a capitalist country that lets the rich steal but locks up the poor and calls it justice. It's politicians stuffing their pockets while you beg for insulin prices to come down. If your God really was about to rain down fire and brimstone, do you really think he'd be aiming it at the gay bars? Or do you think maybe, just maybe, he'd be looking at the megachurches with private jets, the politicians cutting food stamps, and the Wall Street grifters turning human lives into stock options? If God's about to smite anyone, it's not the drag queens. It's the frauds wearing his name like a brand logo while spitting on everything that he supposedly stands for. And nowhere is that more obvious than in a country where feeding the hungry isn't just discouraged, it's a crime. You claim America is one nation under God, yet you've made it illegal to practice the most fundamental Christian principle: charity. If Jesus tried to hand out loaves and fish in half this country, he'd be fined, arrested, or tackled by a cop who feared for his life. I swear, the trout looked like a pistol. Let's talk about where you've outlawed basic decency. Las Vegas, Nevada. Feeding the homeless in public? That's illegal. But gambling your rent away at a casino? Totally fine. Birmingham, Alabama. You can buy a gun at 18, but if you hand a sandwich to a homeless person, well, you're gonna get fined. Dallas, Texas. If you can legally refuse service to LGBTQ plus people, but giving food to the starving, well, that's where they draw the line. In Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a 91-year-old World War II veteran was arrested for feeding the homeless. A man who fought actual fucking Nazis in his youth was treated like a criminal for giving people food. Tell me more about how wonderful Christian America is. You've turned mercy into a misdemeanor. You don't want to fix poverty, you want to punish people for surviving it. The Bible you love to cherry pick couldn't be clearer. Proverbs 14:31. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Matthew 25:35-40. For I was hungry when you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of my brothers and sisters, of mine, you did for me. Unless you're in Fort Lauderdale, in which case Jesus can take it up with the cops, I guess. Your laws don't reflect Christ, they reflect Rome, the empire that crucified him for standing with the poor. And now you want to rewrite history to make it so that somehow you're the good guys? Spare me. You preach what would Jesus do, but if he showed up tomorrow, you'd throw him in jail for feeding the homeless without a fucking permit. You've criminalized the Good Samaritan. Your world doesn't just tolerate poverty, it needs it. Somehow, someone has to suffer for you to feel righteous. If the system lifted everyone up, who would scrub your toilets and bag your groceries for starvation wages? Christians don't want to end poverty, they want to manage it, keeping the poor desperate and grateful. You don't follow Christ, you follow a system that nailed him to a cross and then slapped his name on the merchandise. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to end suffering. You just want to make sure it stays beneath you. You talk about lifting people up, but the truth is, your entire world depends on keeping people down. America doesn't just tolerate poverty, it engineers it. It's not a flaw in the system, it is the system. Because if everyone had enough, who would be desperate enough to work for nothing? Who would scrub your toilets for starvation wages? Who would risk their lives in a warehouse for next day shipping? Who would fight your wars so defense contractors can cash another check? Who would break their backs so CEOs can buy a fourth yacht? The answer is simple. No one. And that's why they keep the cycle running. Wages stay low, rent stays high, healthcare stays out of reach, not because they have to, but because they want to. Because a population struggling to survive doesn't have the time, the money, or the power to fight back. You ever notice how every solution to poverty is just a way to make being poor slightly more bearable? But it never ends it, does it? Food banks instead of fair wages. GoFundMes instead of universal health care. Charity drives instead of housing rights. They don't want to solve the problem. They just want to manage it. Keep the poor just desperate enough to take what they can get, just thankful enough to shut up about how rigged the game is. Christian nationalists love to talk about humility and gratitude, but only for people beneath them. They don't want the poor to thrive. They want them to be grateful for scraps. And when the poor start demanding more, well, that's when they start screaming about handouts and personal responsibility. Because in their minds, poverty is a moral failing, not a rigged system designed to keep them in power. But let's check the actual Bible again, shall we? Proverbs 22:16. Whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth or gives to the rich will only come to poverty. James 5:1-4. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. Jesus didn't say blessed are the billionaires, he flipped their fucking tables. And if he walked into America today, he'd be flipping more than tables. He'd be flipping entire systems. But you don't follow Christ. You follow capitalism in a cheap cross necklace. You replace the Sermon on the Mount with, if you're poor, it's your fault. Christian nationalists don't serve the poor. They use them as a talking point, as a political prop, as a cautionary tale. Anything but human beings who deserve dignity. Because if poverty ended, you'd lose the moral high ground you think you have. No more humble servant act. No more Christian charity tax breaks. No more look how generous we are photo ops. And that terrifies you. Because if the playing field were actually leveled, you'd have nothing left to stand on. You don't worship Christ. You worship capital. The church isn't a house of God, it's a franchise. Your prosperity gospel isn't faith, it's a scam where the poor give what little they have and the pastors drive off in Bentleys. Let's be real. If Jesus came back today, you'd call him a radical leftist. He'd demand universal health care. You'd call it socialism. He'd tell the rich to give away their wealth. You'd call that class warfare. He'd say love your neighbor, you'd ask for a border wall. You don't follow Christ. You follow capitalism with a cross sticker slapped on it. The Sermon on the Mount has been replaced with the Gospel of Wall Street, where every blessing has a price tag and every prayer ends in a donation request. Because in your world, God doesn't reward the righteous. He rewards the profitable. Look at the megachurches, the prosperity gospel preachers, the televangelists dripping in gold like they're auditioning for a rap video. These are the people you follow, the ones who turned the house of God into a tax-free empire. Joel Osteen locked his megachurch doors when Houston flooded. But sure, tell me more about Christian generosity. Kenneth Copeland flies in a private jet because commercial planes are full of demons, while Jesus walked everywhere and hung out with lepers. Creflo Dollar literally told his congregation he needed a $65 million jet because Flying Coach wouldn't let him spread the word properly. These aren't churches, they're corporations. And the only thing they're preaching is salvation is available for 3 easy payments of $99.99 plus tax. Meanwhile, their followers scrape by on minimum wage, writing checks they can't afford because they've been convinced that giving to the church will somehow trick God into fixing their credit score. Their prosperity gospel is a scam. It's just trickle-down economics with a few Bible verses stapled to it. It tells the poor their suffering is part of God's plan. It tells the rich their wealth is a divine blessing. And it tells struggling people that if they just pray hard enough, maybe they'll be rich too someday. But let's check that actual Bible again, shall we? Matthew 6:24. You cannot serve both God and money. Mark 10:25. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Luke 16:13. No servant can serve 2 masters. You will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Oops. If Jesus walked into one of your mega churches today, he wouldn't be on stage. He'd be spitting in the face of the pastor. And you'd be the one calling security. Because Christian nationalism isn't about faith. It's about power. It's not about serving God. It's about using him as a corporate mascot for your political empire. You've turned Jesus into a brand, a marketing gimmick, a prop for your culture war. And if he is real and you stand before him one day, I hope you have a good excuse for why your idea of Christian values looks more like a billionaire's tax plan than the gospel. Because I gotta say, I don't think he'd buy it. If Jesus came back today, you wouldn't worship him. You'd call him a socialist, deport him, and keep donating to those same crooks who sold him out the first time. Sycophants. Nothing more, nothing less.